We started off our conversation in the first process group, initiating process group, with develop project charter, and then we worked down the chart, right? So develop project charter is what's used to make the project real. It creates the charter, an agreement between the sponsor and the project manager saying, here's our power to knock out this task. And there's usually reports and, different reporting criteria or controls on the project manager, like definition of done, deadlines, things like that in the charter as well, to make sure they're not abusing that power. So it's an understanding between the sponsor and the project manager, signed by the sponsor, handing them their power in order to make the project real. And the project manager now has their marching orders, do these things, go, got it, good. All right, so that's 4.1. 13.1 would have had to happen in the background for that to work, though, because 13.1, identify stakeholders, is used to find every stakeholder in the project, including the sponsor and the project manager's name, right? So at some point in time, somewhere in the organization, someone had to decide this project manager is best for that project. That's identify stakeholders as well. Remember, the processes are in the project management book of knowledge, not the project manager's book of knowledge, right? There are processes that are organizational at times. Identify stakeholders could be one, right? But identify stakeholders never really ends. It's always going on. It's part of what the project manager is always doing, identifying stakeholders and then writing those stakeholders' names down on the stakeholder register. So 13.1 builds the stakeholder register one entry at a time throughout the entire project. The stakeholder register is a living document. It's one of the documents on page 89. All right, so that completes the first process group of initiating. Then we moved on into the planning process group. And in 4.2, which is used to bookend all of planning, it synchronizes the planning process group to make your project management plan and get it approved. Then we moved into the processes within planning, starting in scope management with 5.1, plan scope management, which gives us the SOP from the organization saying this is how we want you to build a scope baseline and track requirements. There's two different plans for that, the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, both of which typically already exist in the organization or falling in line. Is there a chance that we have to write it because we're the first one? Maybe. Or maybe it's because our project's so different. Both of that process uses alternative analysis. At times we have to rewrite the plan, or because our project's so different, the SOP won't work, so we got to make our own version of it. But either way, 5.1 is the process that creates the scope management plan and the requirements management plan, discussing the scope baseline, how it's going to be approved, who approves it, how we change it, and how we report against it. The requirements management plan mainly discusses how we're going to track requirements using the requirements traceability matrix, and then document information about requirements on requirement documentation. Then we moved on in our conversation to 5.2, where we actually did it. That's about our project. When we find requirements, we document them on requirement documentation and save it in the appropriate folder according to the requirements management plan. In 5.3, define scope, that's when we put it all together and say how we're going to meet each requirement in the project, defining the scope of the project. It's a very detailed document called the scope statement. The more detailed, the better. It becomes one of the factors or parts of the scope baseline, which is created in 5.4. Create WBS, which makes the WBS and WBS dictionary, puts them all together with the scope statement, and that's the scope baseline. The WBS is used to show as an image the work broken down into different parts and how we're going to pay for that work, kind of tying the bow on the work and accounting. We put that with the scope statement, which explains it, saying how we're going to meet the scope of the project, and that's the scope baseline. That concludes planning for scope. While that's going on, you had to have been doing other processes. It'd be kind of hard to create the scope baseline without some understanding of the schedule and cost. All right, so in schedule management, we started off our conversation 6.1. 6.1 gives us a schedule management plan, which says how we're going to schedule and use our systems, what the unit of measure is, how we round, how we estimate, and how we use our documents in order to create a project schedule, get the schedule approved, calling it the schedule baseline, and then we maintain that through the project and how we submit change requests to change that if we have to. It also discusses how reports are given and when reports are due. 6.2, define activities. That's the one for our project. See, 6.1 could have happened before you were even in the organization. It's more of an SOP. 6.2, though, that's your project. That's where the project manager is decomposing the work to its smallest components. And that could be the activity level. On test day, it will be the activity level. Right? So we'll document information about each activity on activity attributes and then save it according to the plan. Otherwise, it becomes a soup sandwich because there's thousands of activities. We use the activity list to keep it all straight, and it's tailored to the project manager's needs, so you can then sort it and filter it based off what you're looking for in your project. That all happens in 6.2, define activities. 6.3, sequence activities. That's about the precedence of events and how we want the work to actually go down. So we create an image called the precedence network diagram that shows the flow of work across one area of the project, maybe the entire thing, maybe just one phase, creating a schedule network diagrams, plural, right? On test day, it's going to be singular though. showing the flow of work. But what isn't on there is the dependency determination. The dependency determination is the reason why I've scheduled it that way is not on the diagram. That would be written down on the activity attribute. All right, so then we moved on in our conversation to 6.4, estimate activity duration, where we try to figure out what is the duration of that task by taking the time expected and adding contingency reserve to it in proportion to the risk. That's how we create duration estimates. The duration estimates just populate the activity attribute, right? Maybe the activity list. Now there is a duration estimate for that one task. The idea is that kind of goes hand in hand with the activity attribute. Also, there's the basis of estimates, which is the reason or the justification as to why we believe that estimate is correct. That's all created in 6.4, estimate activity duration, 1 per activity. All right, then 6.5, develop schedule, is when we put it all together and say this is the schedule for the project. That's where we talked critical path method, but that's only one of many methodologies to create a schedule. The project schedule is the main output of the process. At times, though, we can't create the entire project schedule because of the methodology selected. We can only create project calendars, which are like for the next phase only or the next sprint, whereas the project schedule is everything. But either way, we get it approved, and that's called the schedule baseline. So it could be ballparked in Agile using historical information, or it could be bottom up, like in predictive projects where we create the schedule baseline based off of all of the activities. All right, but the 6.5 creates that schedule baseline, gets it approved, and that concludes planning for scheduling. In Chapter 7, 7.1, Plan Cost Management gives us the cost management plan, saying exactly how costs should work, how we use our systems, how to create a cost baseline, how to control costs throughout the project. It's the how-to guide, another SOP typically owned by the project management office, shoved down your throat during training, and you're going to follow it or get fired. Well, or you could change it. It's possible your project's so different the SOP won't work, in which case you go back to the drawing board and come up with a better SOP or a new one, and you write it down. That's all covered in 7.1. Typically it already exists and you're falling in line with it. 7.2 is where the project manager picks up the work and actually finds information about these activities by estimating for their costs. So in that process, we're looking at smaller components of work and trying to figure out how much it should cost to do that task and then add contingency reserve to it. We talked about PERT there. We talked about using triangular distribution and a beta distribution to find time expected and then adding in contingency reserve based off that standard deviation formula and confidence intervals. All right, so we put it all together, and that's the cost estimate for that task. Once we have done that for all of the tasks, then we can roll that up using cost aggregation in 7.3 to create the cost baseline. Sometimes, though, we're ballparking it, and we're just, shooting, from the hip and saying the whole thing should cost $2 million. That's historical information review. And that's another way of doing this, just ballparking it in that process in 7.3, right? We could be building it bottom up, or we could just be random guess, just based from historical projects, it's this much. All right, but that creates the cost baseline. The cost baseline's approved. The next thing we did is we moved into quality management. The quality management knowledge area starts off with 8.1, plan quality management, which is when it's unlike the other management plans. This one is an actual plan for our project based off of our project requirements and the contract vehicle we're working off of, if we sold something, that is. So we're going to make sure that we're checking the requirements in the right way, with the right instrumentation, with the right things. And there's going to be some SOPs there from the organization, some best practice from the organization on how to do testing. That will be incorporated. Those are the OPAs. There'll also be EEFs, though, physical limitations on the testing. There's only so accurate, and then also mathematical principles that'll be EEFs as well. But we design the actual testing in this process. We design how it's supposed to work. We design the grading scale to say pass or fail. We also say who's going to do the testing, when the testing takes place, and how they fill out the quality control measurement, the form proving the test actually happened, and they can save it. It's the receipt. All right, so you're showing the testing did take place for this widget, and it was saved. Right, so the plan discusses it. We're not doing it yet. We're just saying this is how it's supposed to work. That's 8.1, the quality management plan. 9.1, plan resource management, creates the resource management plan, saying how we're going to, keep track of all these human resources and physical resources, making sure the physical resources are being maintained and taken care of. At the same time, the human resources are being trained. We're building this cohesive team. We're evaluating the team, mentoring individuals as needed. So there are some EEFs there that come from HR as far as like pay tables and how we fire people and how we hire people. But there's a lot of OPAs there too, as far as like how I'm going to motivate my crew and how I'm going to use team building or how I'm going to train them or what's my preferred training method. So that's all in 9.1, plan resource management. 9.2, estimate activity resources, and we're the last of the 3 estimating processes we discuss. Now remember, it's more about that activity as far as which one you start with. Just because we discussed estimating duration first doesn't mean that happens first. It's about the constraints for that one activity. That's when you start that estimating process. So depending on its constraints, That dictates which estimating process goes first, whichever the more constraining factor is. The boss says you only have Jill and Bob to do the task. Estimate resources done, right? But if you have a budget, get it done for less than $10,000, then you're trying to find the resources that can get it done within that dollar amount. All right, so anyway, the last of the estimating processes we discussed was 9.2, estimate activity resource. We're trying to figure out the human resources and physical resources needed to do that task. Once we've determined that, we'll populate the resource breakdown structure with that information as well. The resource breakdown structure shows all resources needed for the entire project. But that one activity will have its resources needed for it and the basis of estimates, which explains why we believe that to be true. And then we moved into communication in 10.1. Plan communication management creates the communication management plan. It's the how, who, when, what, where, how for communicating. It discusses each platform and the appropriate use of that platform, how to archive information on it, how to create information with it, how to destroy that information when needed. It's the how-to guide for communications. Then in chapter 11, risk management, we started off our conversation with the risk management plan. The risk management plan is created in 11.1, plan risk management. It's an SOP from the organization saying, hey, project manager, this is how we view risk. Here's our appetite for risk. This is the threshold for risk. This is what we're considering not risky enough to even be part of the project. This is how we use our documentation. This is how we want you to elevate things, what we determine high, medium, and low, and how we score risk. Right, so it's typically using a risk breakdown structure, breaking it into categories, and then defining the policies per category, and then a probability impact matrix per category, so you can grade it and compare risks to each other, apples to apples, right? But anyway, that's planned risk management. It's typically done by the organization, and you're falling in line as the project manager. It's kind of the rules for the game we call your career, so you probably should have one of those. If you don't, you should probably make one. But anyway, that's 11.1. The risk management plan. It's possible the project manager makes their own in a one-off situation. That's why alternative analysis is a tool and technique there. But anyway, we'll move on, acting as if the project management office gave it to us. All right, so 11.2, identify risk, is when we find risk events and then populate the risk register with those events. We'll find more and more information about them, so we'll keep on updating the risk register throughout the project. It never really ends. Identify risk, just like identify stakeholders, is happening all the time. Those are the two processes that are always going on. The saying is, I identify all the time. The two processes that start with the letter I, identify stakeholders and identify risk, those are the only two I processes. They're always happening. All right, so identify risk is always going on, updating the risk register with more risk events and then changing it as needed. 11.3, perform qualitative risk analysis. We're trying to figure out how risky is that risk event compared to the population of risk. That's where we're determining high, medium, and low, right? For some of those risk events, we're kicking them off to the watch list because they score too low. The next process, 11.4, is a little rare, but it is used for typically for those major risk events. We're trying to figure out like a special contingency reserve for it, right? Because it touches upon many activities, what we call an overall risk event. Now, it could be done for smaller ones, but typically it's done for the overall risk events. We're trying to set up a contingency reserve for like the hurricane or something. That's 11.4, setting aside contingency reserve, typically in proportion to the probability and impact of that risk, using expected monetary value, probability times impact, to figure out how much money to set aside or time for that risk event. In 11.5, plan risk response, that's when we come up with the strategies to handle different risk events. The strategies that we covered, there are 10 of them in total, 5 for threats, 5 for opportunities. They're essentially the same idea. They're all just shades of mitigate, right? But anyway, if you're trying to apply the right strategy for the right type of risk, that happens in 11.5. We update the risk register with that strategy and the risk report sometimes, those bigger risk events that usually the sponsors want to know about, and we'll write the strategy down there as well. That closes 11.5 and concludes planning for risk in our conversation. The next process we discussed was 12.1, plan procurement management, where we come up with the procurement management plan. When I say we, I mean the organization, and shoves it down our throat, because if we don't follow it, we're getting fired, right? It's saying how to buy stuff. You usually don't get to make this one up. The organization already has it. They have any policies at all. It's how to buy something. All right, so we're going to follow those policies and do the right thing. 12.1 is making sure we have the plan to buy stuff if we need to. Now, it also discusses the procurement strategy, which is a tailored version of the policies for that thing that we know we're going to buy. Sometimes we know that right off the bat that we're going to be subbing this area of the project out. So we have a procurement strategy typically to maintain profitability. That's 12.1. 13.2, plan stakeholder engagement, is looking at that stakeholder and determining what is the desired engagement, typically using the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix on page 522 to do that. So we figure out what is the desired engagement level with that stakeholder versus the current level of engagement, and we use the plan to bridge the gap. Then we ends planning for our conversation, and we moved into execution. The execution process group is bookended by 4.3, direct and manage project work. It synchronizes everything, the doing of the plan, to make deliverables. It makes all deliverables and data 4.3. 4.4 is used to find best practice and lessons learned and archive that in something called the Lessons Learned Register. Our Lessons Learned Register should feed the beast, right? The organization is hoarding this somewhere, typically the project management office, and they save it in something called the Lessons Learned Repository. And that's not a trash can. Hopefully it's not a trash can. Please, God, don't be a trash can. Usually the organization saves it, though, so they can disseminate it to other project managers if they want to stay in business, that is. All right, so that's 4.4. 8.2, manage quality. That's when we're actually looking at the plan to make sure the plan's written correctly and that we're not making things up as far as physics goes. Like, yeah, that's not going to work because that instrumentation doesn't measure in meters, it measures in inches. So we've got to make sure we're using the right instruments for the right type of test. That's happening at 8.2, making sure we interpreted the requirements correctly and we're testing it in the right way, using the best practice, but also making sure it's being done, making sure people are actually doing it. They're not just pencil whipping the reports. All right, so we're going to actually look at the documentation to prove it, oftentimes using a quality audit. The auditor will be someone who's not the project manager and not on the project management team, meaning if they had a hand in writing the plan, they shouldn't be the one doing the audit, just like you shouldn't do your own dental work. Have somebody else do it. You can do it yourself, it's just not a good idea. So the movie Castaway? Anyway, 8.2, manage quality, is used to make sure there is a plan and it's being followed. No deliverables are touched in that process. 9.3, acquire resources when you're fighting for the resources in your project, the human resources and the physical resources, either using negotiation, which is fancy for stealing it from Miguel, or, pre-assigned team members, something like that, to get the resources needed. And so that's physical and team members, right? So it's not just, Bob, Jill, and Jane. It's also truck 218 and meeting room 12. That all happens in 9.3, acquire resources. 9.4, develop team. That's when we're actually using the collective training for the collective tasks to make sure that the team is proficient in what they have to do. Also motivating the team and team building, that all happens there as well. 9.5 is the individual process when we're talking to Bob and mentoring Bob and solving problems and conflicts between Bob and Jill or something. We're writing it down in the issue log for interpersonal conflicts if we have one of those hurt feeling reports. So that's 9.5. So 9.4 is the team, 9.5 is the individual. 10.2, manage communications, is making sure the communications management plan is actually being worked, right? So people are actually doing it. They're creating communications based off of the needs in the project. So they're just picking up the phone and calling people. 10.2 creates all communications, whether it's emails, phone calls, text messages. 10.2 makes them all. 11.6, implement risk responses, the doing of that risk strategy, whatever the heck it is. Once the trigger event occurs, bam, we knock it out. That's 11.6, doing the strategy. 12.2, conduct procurement, is actual buying things. It's when we decide that we want to buy that thing. We do the make or buy analysis. We determine we're going to buy it, and bam, we go ahead and start going down the route to contracting. So it starts from good idea fairy all the way till contract signed. That's 12.2. The onboarding of the contractor, the vendor, the managing of that contractor, that's all 12.3. So it ends at signing of the contract. 13.3, manage stakeholder engagement, is actually doing the stakeholder engagement plan. Right, hopefully we're moving the needle and getting them either more or less engaged, whatever our desire is. That ends execution. We move on to monitor and controlling. And 4.5, monitor and control project work. We're making reports. We're looking at different information, determining what the stakeholders need, key stakeholders, sponsor, whoever wants that report. We're compiling it into that report as needed. So 4.5 creates reports based off of information. Work performance information is an output of everything else in monitoring and controlling. All right, so 4.6, perform integrated change control procedures. We're looking at change requests and saying yes or no to them, kicking out the ones that are going to affect other requirements negatively, implementing the ones that are a good idea and are going to work. Hopefully they're going to work. Typically using a change control board, though. On test day, we're going to assume it's a change control board. But the PMBOK does discuss doing this on your own. Autocratic decision-making is a tool and technique there, the dictatorship. So yes, it's possible the PM makes that decision. But on test day, we're going to assume there's a change control board, and they'll be the ones saying yes or no to change requests. 5.5, validate scope, is when we've actually made the widget and we show it to the end user and they say, yes, that's what I wanted. Right, so after we've tested it though, right, we're gonna make sure it meets all the tests, right, because we like our career, we don't get fired, right, so we're gonna make sure that it meets the test, and we've tested everything, it's a verified deliverable, it's gone through process 8.3, we've checked it, then we hand it over to that customer and say, what do you think? And they go, it's perfect, make 1 million more. That's 5.5, validate scope, it creates accepted deliverables, or they say, no, it's not what I wanted, we go back to the drawing board. 5.6, control scope, that's making sure we're kicking out the scope creep, then when it rears its ugly head, also kicking out the gold plating, a type of scope creep that happens from within the team. They sneak things in, looking at you, Agile. All right, so that's 5.6, controlling scope within the project. 6.6, control schedules, and we're looking at the work that's taken place so far versus the plan to say ahead of schedule or behind schedule, oftentimes using schedule variance and schedule performance index from earned value management. 7.4 is where we talked earned value management. Control costs is when we're looking at the costs in the project so far in order to say over budget or under budget. We're going to use earned value for that, typically cost variance and cost performance index, CV and CPI. And from that information, we can then forecast when the project might end and how many dollars it'll take to get there. That's called estimate at completion. The dollar amount needed to complete all of the work are the estimated dollars at completion of the project. Or we can figure out ETC, estimate to completion, how many more dollars from right now until we hit that point. All right, so that's earned value in 7.4. 8.3, control quality, is the act of actually checking deliverables. This is when we're picking up a deliverable, or Bob is at least, following the plan, checking it according to the plan, and filling out quality control measurements and saving it according to the plan. 9.6, control resources. This is actually making sure the physical resources are being taken care of and they're functioning correctly. Otherwise, we got to order new ones or change training on the team. 10.3, monitor communications, is making sure the communication management plan works. If not, we got to change the plan. Sometimes the platforms don't work or people have access to things and we got to buy new ones. So it might require a change request, but it's a little rare. 11.7, monitor risk, is the reassessment of risk events. Some of these risk events we know we're going to do this for. We have risk reassessment meetings already scheduled. Other times we use a risk audit to scrub the entire risk register to make sure the strategy is viable and the risk owners know what they're supposed to do. 12.3, controlled procurement, is when we're making sure these vendors are doing what they're supposed to do and making the widgets we wanted. So we're going to be acting like the sponsor here and validating scope for them and looking at the widget and saying, yes, that's what I wanted, make $1 million more or something. So that's when we're managing the vendor all the way from contract signed to closure of the contract and paying the vendor. So there could be hiccups and problems that happen there. They could be reporting to you. You might see another healthy dose of earned value or critical path there because you're acting like the sponsor in 12.3 all the way till you close that contract. 13.4, monitor stakeholder engagement, is making sure the stakeholder engagement plan works. Sometimes it's redoing the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix to see if we're moving the needle, right? Otherwise, we got to change the strategy if it doesn't work. We might go back to the drawing board, maybe even change communication management plan and add more platforms because people aren't getting the information needed. But 13.4 is just ensuring the strategy is working. Otherwise, we change the plan. 4.7, close project or phase, is used to close the project or the phase, just like it says. So almost everything is an input there because we're archiving it for best practice and lessons learned. We're also going to create the final report, right? The final report is the yin to the yang of the charter. It officially closes the project. You'll be asked more about the concept of it and not what it looks like because everyone has it looking differently, but the purpose is always the same. It's to close the project. So it's the opposite of the charter, which is used to start the project. And the charter also transitions power from the sponsor to you. The closing report transitions power from you back to the sponsor. And that concludes all 49 processes.